The lawyer's voice cut through the silence like a blade. To Maya Chen, I leave the old fishing lodge on Cedar Lake. My sisters exchanged glances across the mahogany table, barely containing their smirks. After everything I'd sacrificed, after 5 years of my life spent caring for our father while they lived their perfect lives, this was my reward, a crumbling cabin nobody had visited in decades. If you're watching this story unfold, you're about to witness something extraordinary. What started as the most devastating day of my life became the foundation for the most satisfying transformation you could imagine. You'll see how a family torn apart by greed and neglect found their way back to each other, but not before some well-deserved lessons were learned. The twists ahead will leave you questioning everything you think you know about justice, family, and what inheritance really means. Make sure to hit that subscribe button because this journey is just beginning, and trust me, you won't want to miss a single moment of what happens next. I'm Maya, though most people call me May. At 55, I just finished watching my father, renowned pianist David Chen, slip away after a long battle with dementia. While my older sister Grace built her marketing empire and my younger sister Sophie climbed the corporate ladder in finance, I was the one who moved back home. I was the one who learned about medications and doctor appointments. I was the one who held his hand during the worst moments and celebrated the small victories when he remembered my name. Grace, now 59, had always been the ambitious one. She owned a successful advertising agency and lived the kind of life that looked perfect on social media. Expensive clothes, fancy restaurants, weekend trips to wine country. "You're so good at taking care of people," she'd say whenever I suggested she visit more often. As if being caring was some kind of personality flaw that automatically made me the family caregiver. Sophie, at 47, worked in investment banking and had inherited our father's talent for numbers, though she used it to make rich people richer instead of creating beautiful music. She'd visit twice a year, bringing expensive gifts and staying just long enough to take photos with Dad before flying back to her busy, important life. "We help financially," she'd remind me, as if writing checks could replace actually being present. The thing about being the responsible daughter is that everyone assumes you chose it. Like I woke up one morning and decided to put my nursing career on hold to become a full-time caregiver. The truth was, someone had to do it, and when Grace was restructuring major accounts and Sophie was closing important deals, that someone was always me. Dad's condition had gotten worse over the past year. Some days he'd forget we existed. Other days he'd play piano for hours, his fingers remembering melodies even when his mind couldn't remember our names. During those lucid moments, he'd look at me with such gratitude that I knew I'd made the right choice, even when it felt like I was disappearing a little more each day. The morning of the will reading, I sat in my car outside the lawyer's office, watching Grace step out of her BMW in a designer suit that probably cost more than I'd spent on clothes in 2 years. Sophie arrived in an Uber, talking loudly on her phone about some merger that couldn't wait even for our father's final wishes to be revealed. They barely acknowledged me as we walked into the building together. Grace was already discussing her plans for Dad's music catalog with Sophie, assuming they'd inherit his business together and graciously include me in some minor way. The entitlement was breathtaking, but not surprising. The lawyer, Mr. Harrison, had known our family for decades. He'd handled Dad's contracts and business affairs since before we were born. As he read through the preliminary items, family photos, personal mementos, Dad's piano going to a local music school, my sisters grew restless. They were waiting for the real money, the significant assets that would validate their assumption that financial success mattered more than emotional sacrifice. To Grace Elizabeth Chen, Mr. Harrison continued, I leave Chin Musical Productions, including all publishing rights, recording royalties, and business assets. Grace's face lit up with satisfaction. Dad's company was worth several $1,000,000, built over 40 years of composing and performing. To Sophie Marie Chen, I leave my investment portfolio, including stocks, bonds, and retirement accounts. Sophie actually smiled, probably calculating the value in her head. Dad had been smart with money, and his investments had grown substantially over the years. Then came my turn. To Maya Lin Chen, I leave the fishing lodge on Cedar Lake, along with all contents and property therein. The silence that followed was broken by Grace's barely contained laughter. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "I guess Dad knew who really understood him these past few years." The way she emphasized "really" made it clear she thought Dad had lost his mind completely. Sophie leaned forward, her professional smile firmly in place. "Maybe if you'd managed the caregiving situation more efficiently, Maya, Dad might have felt differently about your capabilities." The casual cruelty of that comment took my breath away. I stared at the old brass key Mr. Harrison slid across the table. It was tarnished and looked like it belonged in an antique shop rather than opening anything valuable. This was it. After giving up 5 years of my life, after watching my savings disappear while my sisters built their fortunes, after sacrificing relationships and career opportunities to be present for our father's decline, this rusty key was my inheritance. Grace was already whispering to Sophie about maintenance costs and how quickly they could sell that old eyesore. They assumed I'd need their help, their expertise, their financial guidance to deal with whatever problems came with owning a deteriorating property. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling unsteady. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," I said quietly, taking the key. I looked at my sisters, who were already planning how to divide the responsibility of helping their poor, unfortunate sister deal with her burdensome inheritance. "I hope you both find everything you're looking for," I told them, then walked out of that office feeling like I'd been slapped. The drive to Cedar Lake took nearly 3 hours, giving me plenty of time to process what had just happened. Here I was, 55 years old, unemployed since I'd quit nursing to care for Dad, living off rapidly shrinking savings, and now the proud owner of what Grace had cheerfully called that money pit. My phone rang twice during the drive. First Grace, offering to help coordinate repairs so we could get the property sold quickly. Then Sophie, suggesting I might want to consider my realistic options given my financial situation. I turned the phone off after the second call. The road to the lake was exactly as I remembered from childhood visits, winding dirt paths through thick trees, eventually opening up to glimpses of water through the branches. When Mom was alive, we'd spent summers here as a family. Back then, it had felt magical. Dad would play guitar on the dock, while Mom read books in the hammock. Grace, Sophie, and I would spend hours swimming and building elaborate sand castles. Those memories felt like they belonged to different people entirely. When I finally pulled up to the lodge, my heart sank. The building looked even worse than I'd expected. Blue paint peeled from the siding like sunburned skin. The covered porch sagged in the middle, and Mom's once beautiful flower garden had been completely overtaken by weeds and wild growth. I sat in my car for several minutes, staring at the physical representation of my inheritance. This was what 5 years of sacrifice had earned me, a building that would probably cost more to repair than it was worth. Grace and Sophie had inherited millions. I had inherited a full-time renovation project with no money to fund it. But as I finally forced myself to get out of the car and walk toward the front door, something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling sorry for myself, I found myself remembering those golden summers when our family was actually happy. Before competition and resentment had turned us into strangers who happened to share the same last name. The old key from the lawyer didn't fit the front door lock, which was puzzling. But I remembered Dad showing me where he kept the spare key during our last visit together 2 years ago, under a loose board on the front steps. Sure enough, there it was, though this key looked much newer than everything else about the property. The inside of the lodge surprised me. While the exterior looked abandoned, someone had clearly been maintaining the interior. The electricity worked when I flipped the switches. The water ran clear from the kitchen faucet. There was even food in the pantry, canned goods and dried items with recent expiration dates. On the kitchen table, I found an envelope with my name written in Dad's distinctive handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it, expecting maybe a sentimental note about childhood memories or instructions for maintaining the property. Instead, I found something that made me sit down hard in the nearest chair. "My dearest Maya," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then everything has gone according to plan. Go to my study and check behind the bookshelf, you know the one. The combination hasn't changed since your mother's time. What you'll find there belongs to you alone.
Use it well.
The real education begins now. All my love, Dad. I read that letter 3 times before the words fully registered. Dad had been planning something. Something my sisters knew nothing about. Something that had required careful timing and preparation. The study looked exactly as I remembered from our visits. Wood-paneled walls, built-in shelves, and Dad's old upright piano covered with a dusty sheet. The bookshelf he'd mentioned was the one where we used to read together when I was young, back when Grace and Sophie thought books were boring and preferred to spend their time arguing about who got to use the good fishing rod. When I pulled on the shelf, it swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a wall safe I'd never known existed. The combination was Mom's birthday. Of course, Dad would choose something sentimental. With trembling fingers, I turned the dial and heard the lock click open. What I found inside that safe changed everything I thought I knew about my father, my inheritance, and my future. Gold coins gleamed in the dim light. Vintage jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother sparkled from velvet-lined boxes. But it was the thick folders of documents that made me sink to the floor in complete shock. Stock certificates, investment records, bond portfolios, all showing that Dad had been quietly accumulating wealth for decades, separate from his known assets. Conservative estimates put the value at over $4 million. $4 million. More money than I'd ever dreamed of having. A handwritten note tucked inside one folder explained everything. Over 40 years of performing and composing, I saved every bonus, every royalty check, every unexpected payment. While your mother and I lived modestly, I built this treasure one careful investment at a time. I kept it hidden from our regular finances, a secret legacy for the daughter who would need it most. I sat on that dusty floor, surrounded by more wealth than I'd ever imagined possible, and started laughing. Not happy laughter, but the kind that comes when reality flips completely upside down. Well, well, well. The worthless sister had just become the richest one in the family. But there was more. Another folder contained documents showing Dad had been systematically moving money out of his business and known investment accounts over the past 2 years, converting everything to these hidden assets. He'd been methodically dismantling his official wealth while secretly building mine. Then I found the note that made everything click into place. Grace's agency has been surviving on loans for 18 months. Without continued funding, it will collapse within 6 months. Sophie's portfolio contains mostly overvalued stocks I selected specifically because they were due for a major correction. I wanted them to understand what struggle feels like, what desperation feels like, what it's like to need help and have nowhere to turn. Just like you felt for 5 years, my precious daughter. I read that note 5 times before the full implications hit me. Dad hadn't just left me money. He'd orchestrated the systematic destruction of my sister's inheritances while secretly building mine. This wasn't just an inheritance, it was revenge planned with surgical precision. My phone buzzed with a text from Grace. Hope you're settling in okay at the lake. Call if you need help with anything. Family sticks together. I stared at that heart emoji for a long moment, then typed back. Thanks. Everything's perfect here. Just getting to know my new situation. If only she knew exactly how well I was getting to know it. Another text came through from Sophie. Saw some concerning market movements today. Might need to adjust some positions sooner than expected. Nothing serious, just being cautious. Nothing serious. I walked back to the hidden safe and ran my fingers over the gold coins Dad had left me. Each one represented years of careful planning, of watching his daughters take him for granted while the one who actually cared got dismissed as the family servant. Sophie had no idea that her concerning market movements were just the beginning of Dad's carefully orchestrated plan. I spent the next 2 weeks using some of my newfound wealth to restore the lodge. Professional contractors arrived daily to repair the roof, repaint the exterior, and restore Mom's garden to its former beauty. When Grace called to check on me, I told her I'd found some small savings accounts Dad had forgotten to mention in the will. Nothing major, just enough to make the place livable. The lie came easily, and I found myself enjoying the deception. My sisters thought they knew everything about our family's finances, but Dad had been playing a much longer game than any of us realized. Grace's first crisis call came on a Thursday morning while I was sipping coffee on my newly repaired dock. Her voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Maya, I need to talk to you about something," she said, none of her usual confidence evident. "Of course. What's going on?" "It's the agency. We're having some unexpected financial difficulties. Several major clients have pulled their contracts, and there are serious cash flow problems. I don't understand how this happened so quickly." Cash flow problems. Such a polite way to say bleeding money, like a puncture balloon. "That sounds really stressful," I said, watching a contractor install new shutters with money my sisters assumed I didn't have. "How serious are we talking?" "Serious enough that I might need to sell some personal assets just to keep the doors open. The whole situation doesn't make sense. Dad always said I had good business instincts." "Oh, Dad knew exactly what kind of business instincts you had. Is there anything I can do to help?" I offered, knowing exactly what was coming next. The pause stretched so long I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "Well," Grace's voice got even smaller, "I was wondering if you might be able to lend me some money. Just temporarily, until I can stabilize things. Maybe $20,000 or $25,000. $25,000. 6 months ago, that would have represented my entire life savings. Now it was pocket change compared to what Dad had secretly left me. Amazing how Grace suddenly remembered I existed the moment she needed financial help. "Oh, Grace," I said, letting genuine disappointment color my voice. "I'm so sorry. Between fixing up the lodge and covering Dad's final medical expenses, I'm barely managing myself. I wish I could help, but I just don't have that kind of money available."
Right.
"Of course. I shouldn't have asked. Have you talked to Sophie? Maybe she could help." "Sophie has her own problems right now." "What kind of problems?" "You should probably ask her yourself." After we hung up, I couldn't help admiring Dad's timing. He planned everything so perfectly that both my sisters would hit their financial crises simultaneously, leaving them nowhere to turn but to each other, or to me. My phone rang again within an hour. Sophie this time, and she sounded like she'd been crying. "Maya, do you have a few minutes to talk?" "Always have time for family," I said, the irony not lost on me. "I'm having some challenges with investment portfolio Dad left me. Some of the positions have performed much worse than expected." Performed worse. Such an elegant way to say crashed and burned. "What kind of challenges?" "Significant losses. Enough that I'm going to need to make some major lifestyle adjustments." Her voice cracked. "I might have to sell my condo." Sell her penthouse condo and move to what? A cardboard box? "Sophie, I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do?" The same pause Grace had given me, loaded with pride swallowing itself whole. "I was wondering, would you mind if I came up to the lake for a few days? Just to clear my head and think through my options. I could help with any repairs you're doing, contribute to groceries." My youngest sister, who used to spend more on a single dinner than most people made in a week, was offering to split grocery bills. "Of course you can come. When were you thinking? This weekend? If that's not too much trouble." "No trouble at all. It'll be nice to have family here." After I hung up, I walked out onto my beautifully restored pier and looked across the lake Dad had loved so much. Both sisters were exactly where his plan had predicted they'd be, desperate, humbled, and turning to the family member they'd spent years dismissing as irrelevant. But here's what Dad might not have expected. I wasn't just going to watch them learn their lesson. I was going to actively teach it. Sophie arrived Friday evening looking like a designer version of defeat. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back messily, her expensive clothes were wrinkled, and she'd lost enough weight that her jewelry looked too big. "The place looks incredible," she said, genuinely amazed as she walked through what had been a deteriorating cabin and was now a beautifully restored retreat. "How did you manage all this?" "I found some investment documents of Dad's while cleaning out his study. Nothing like what you two inherited, but enough to fix this place up properly." The lie rolled off my tongue smoothly. In reality, I'd used a tiny fraction of my secret inheritance to completely transform the lodge. We spent the evening talking more honestly than we had in years. Sophie told me about the true extent of her financial collapse. Not just losing Dad's portfolio, but everything she'd built on top of it. I kept doubling down, she admitted, staring into her wine glass. Every time I lost money, I'd invest more aggressively, trying to recover. Classic gambler's fallacy, and I walked right into it. How bad is it really? Bad enough that I'll probably lose my condo next month. Maybe my car too. She laughed bitterly. 6 months ago, I was giving financial advice to millionaires. Now I can't even manage my own money. Saturday morning, Grace arrived looking equally defeated, but trying harder to hide it. The three Chin sisters together again, though none of us looked quite like we used to. "This is really beautiful, Maya," Grace said, examining the restored kitchen. "You've done an amazing job here." "It's been therapeutic," I said, which was true in ways she couldn't imagine. Over lunch, I decided to drop my first strategic hint. "I've been thinking about Dad's last few months," I said casually. "Did either of you notice how sharp he seemed sometimes? Like he was more aware than we expected?" Grace nodded slowly. "There were definitely moments. I thought it might be wishful thinking. What if it wasn't? I let that hang in the air. What if Dad knew exactly what he was doing with his financial decisions?" Sophie put down her sandwich. "What do you mean?" "I mean Dad was brilliant. Every decision he made in his career was calculated." I looked out over the lake. What if his final decisions were calculated too? "You're saying Dad deliberately left us problematic inheritances?" Grace's business instincts were kicking in. "I'm saying Dad was disappointed in how we treated him, how we treated each other, how we treated me." I met their eyes. What if he wanted us to learn something? The silence that followed was heavy with implications. "Learn what exactly?" Grace asked. "What it feels like to struggle. What it feels like to need help and have people dismiss your problems because they're inconvenient." Sophie started crying. Not the dramatic tears she used to deploy at family gatherings, but real, quiet sobs. "Are you saying this is punishment?" "I'm saying maybe Dad wanted us to understand what really matters before it was too late to change." I stood up, giving them space to process. "I'm going to take a walk. You two should talk." As I headed toward the water, I heard Grace say to Sophie, "Do you think she knows something she's not telling us?" Smart woman. Too bad it had taken financial ruin to make her start asking the right questions. When I returned an hour later, they were sitting closer together on the couch, holding hands like they used to as children. They'd left me a note when they departed. "Maya, thank you for giving us perspective we desperately needed. Let's not wait so long to see each other again. We love you. G and S." I folded the note carefully. Phase 1 of my plan was complete. Over the next month, I got regular crisis calls from both sisters, and watching Dad's strategy unfold was like witnessing a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Grace's agency was hemorrhaging clients faster than she could replace them. Major accounts were pulling out, citing budget cuts and strategic shifts, though I suspected Dad had arranged some of those departures before his death. "I don't understand it," Grace told me during one of her increasingly frequent panic calls. "Everything Dad built seems to be falling apart, but it's happening so systematically it almost feels intentional." Meanwhile, I was having entirely too much fun being the supportive sister while secretly accelerating their downfall. Using my newfound wealth carefully, I'd hired a discreet financial advisor who specialized in competitive business strategies. Through him, I invested in companies that competed directly with Grace's agency and funded a startup developing automated marketing software that could do Grace's job for a fraction of the cost. "Have you considered pivoting your business model?" I suggested during one call, knowing full well that any pivot would require capital she didn't have. "With what resources?" Grace laughed bitterly. "I'm already operating on borrowed time and borrowed money." For Sophie, my advisor took a different approach. He identified the weakest stocks in her inherited portfolio and executed perfectly legal but strategically timed trades that accelerated their natural decline. Having a team of professionals dedicated to creative financial warfare turned out to be remarkably effective. "The market's been brutal this month," Sophie complained during her weekly breakdown calls. "It's like every position I hold is cursed." "Maybe it's just bad luck," I said sympathetically while checking my computer screen showing how much money I'd made betting against her investments. The best part was how they'd both started treating me like their emotional support sister. Grace called whenever she needed to vent about business disasters. Sophie texted me daily updates about her job search and apartment hunting. "You're the only person I can talk to about this," Grace told me. "You understand struggle in a way, Sophie, and I never did before." Oh, the irony was delicious. But I wasn't content to just watch them suffer from a distance. It was time for some hands-on education. "Why don't you both come up to the lake this weekend?" I suggested. "Sometimes getting away from the city helps put things in perspective." "I can't really afford the gas money," Sophie admitted. "My treat," I said generously. "Family takes care of family, right?" They both arrived Sunday afternoon looking like refugees from their former lives. Grace's designer wardrobe had been replaced with discount store clothing. Sophie's jewelry was gone, sold, she explained, to cover rent. We spent the afternoon fishing like we used to as children. For a few hours, it almost felt like we were sisters again instead of players in Dad's elaborate game. That evening, sitting around the fire pit I'd had installed, Grace asked the question I'd been waiting for. "Maya, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "How did you do it? All those years taking care of Dad, being responsible for everything, never complaining about the sacrifice." I stirred the fire, considering my answer carefully. "I suppose I just focused on what mattered most." "Which was what?" "Love. Family. Being there when someone needed me." I looked directly at her. Not everyone gets to learn those lessons the easy way. Sophie was crying again. "We failed you, didn't we? All those years." "We all made choices," I said gently. "The question is what we choose to do now." "What can we do?" Grace asked. "We're both basically broke. Our careers are in ruins. We have nothing left to offer anyone." I smiled, stirring the fire again. "Maybe that's exactly where you need to be to figure out what you actually have to offer." They were quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. "I used to want to teach," Grace said suddenly. "I remember," I said. "I used to dream about working with children," Sophie added, "before I got obsessed with making money." "Those dreams don't disappear," I told them. "They just wait for you to remember them." The next morning, as they prepared to leave, Grace hugged me longer than she had in years. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not giving up on us." "That's what family does," I said. After they left, I walked back to Dad's hidden safe and ran my fingers over the documents that had made all this possible. Phase 2 was complete. Both sisters were exactly where Dad's plan had predicted, humbled, desperate, and finally open to learning what really mattered. But I wasn't quite ready to end their education yet. Time for the final lesson. The call came at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday. Grace sobbing so hard I could barely understand her words. "Maya, I'm so sorry to wake you, but I didn't know who else to call." I sat up in bed, genuinely concerned despite everything. "What's wrong?" "They're foreclosing on the agency building tomorrow. I have to be out by noon, and I don't know where to put 20 years of files and equipment." She was hyperventilating now. "David's threatening divorce. He says he can't watch me destroy myself anymore. I think I'm having a panic attack." For the first time since discovering Dad's inheritance, I felt a stab of actual guilt. This wasn't just financial pressure anymore. This was complete psychological breakdown. "Grace, listen to me. Breathe. Just breathe." I can't do this anymore, Maya. I've lost everything. Everything." I found myself getting dressed while still on the phone. "I'm driving down. Don't make any decisions until I get there." "You don't have to do that." "Yes, I do. That's what family does." 3 hours later, I was standing in Grace's corporate office, or what used to be her corporate office. Half the furniture was already gone, sold to pay debts. Boxes of files sat waiting to be moved to nowhere. Grace looked like she'd aged a decade in the past month. Her hands shook constantly now, and she developed a nervous habit of checking her phone every few seconds. "I keep thinking Dad would be so disappointed," she said, mechanically loading files into boxes. "He built something real, something lasting, and I destroyed it all in 6 months. Did you destroy it? I asked. Or did you inherit something that was already broken? She looked up at me sharply. What do you mean? This was it. Decision time. I could keep letting Dad's plan play out to its bitter conclusion, or I could choose a different ending. Grace, sit down. There's something I need to tell you. The next hour was one of the hardest conversations I'd ever had. I told her about the safe, about Dad's hidden wealth, about his deliberate sabotage of both their inheritances. $4 million, she whispered. You've had $4 million this whole time. I nodded, waiting for the explosion of anger. You watched us suffer. Grace's voice cracked with fury. You had the power to help us, and you just watched. I watched you learn what actually matters, I said steadily, though my hands were trembling. That's not your decision to make. She stood up, pacing around the boxes. You're not God, Maya. You don't get to decide what lessons we need to learn. Don't I? For 5 years, you decided I needed to learn what sacrifice meant. You decided my life was less important than your careers. You decided. So this is revenge. Grace's eyes were blazing. Elaborate, calculated revenge. This is justice, I said quietly. The silence stretched between us, heavy with years of accumulated pain and fresh betrayal. Finally, Grace sank back into her chair. I should hate you right now. You probably should, but I don't. She looked around at the ruins of her business empire. Because you're right. I did need to lose everything to remember who I was supposed to be. The anger wasn't gone. I could see it still simmering beneath the surface. But something else was there too. Understanding. What do you want to do now? I asked. Grace looked out the window at the Chicago skyline she'd spent decades trying to conquer. I want to teach. I want to work with kids who love music the way we used to. That can be arranged. She laughed, but it wasn't bitter anymore. With Dad's money. With our money. All 3 of us working together on something that matters. My phone buzzed. Sophie texting that she'd been evicted and was sleeping in her car. Ready to rescue our baby sister? I asked. Grace wiped her eyes and picked up her purse. Let's go save Sophie. We found Sophie in a McDonald's parking lot, living out of a Honda that had seen better decades. When she saw us walking toward her car, she tried to pretend everything was fine. Hey, what are you 2 doing here? Staging an intervention, Grace said gently. Everything's under control, Sophie lied, her voice bright and false. Just between apartments right now. I knocked on her car window. Sophie, open the door. It's time to stop pretending. What followed was another tearful revelation, but Sophie's reaction was different from Grace's. Where Grace had eventually found understanding, Sophie felt betrayed. $4 million, she said flatly, staring at the hotel room carpet. You had $4 million while I was sleeping in my car. Sophie. No. She held up her hand. Just no. I need time to process this. She didn't speak to me for the rest of the evening, and the next morning she was gone, leaving only a note. I need space to figure out how I feel about everything. Don't contact me for a while. Grace was more conflicted. I understand why you did it, she said over coffee that morning. But understanding doesn't make it hurt less. I know. Do you? Because for months you watched me have panic attacks. You listened to me cry about losing everything. And you could have stopped it with a phone call. Would you have learned anything if I had? Grace was quiet for a long moment. Probably not. The road to rebuilding our relationships wasn't smooth or quick. Sophie didn't speak to me for 2 months. When she finally called, her first words were, I'm still angry with you. I know. But I also understand why you did it, and I hate that I understand. Grace was quicker to forgive, but slower to trust. Our early conversations were stilted, careful, like we were dancing around a landmine. I keep wondering what else you're not telling me, she admitted during one tense phone call. Nothing, I said. The secrets are over. Are they? Because if you could lie about millions of dollars for months, what else might you be hiding? It took time, real time, measured in awkward family dinners and carefully worded text messages, before we found our way back to something that felt like sisterhood. But eventually we did. During this period, I'd been developing plans of my own. Using Dad's inheritance, I'd been researching ways we could work together on something meaningful. Something that would honor his memory, while actually helping people. I have an idea, I told them during one of our tentative reconciliation dinners. What if we use Dad's money to start a music education program for kids who can't afford lessons? Grace's eyes lit up. Like a community center?
Exactly.
Free lessons, instrument loans, maybe scholarships for advanced students. Sophie, who was slowly warming back up to me, leaned forward. I could handle the financial side. Fundraising, grant applications, managing the endowment. And I could develop the curriculum and hire teachers, Grace added. For the first time in months, we were all excited about the same thing. 6 months after that terrible night in Grace's office, we were standing in the main hall of what would soon become the Chin Center for Musical Education. The building had been a defunct community center on Chicago's west side, perfect for what we had in mind. With Dad's inheritance, we'd purchased it, renovated it completely, and were now weeks away from opening our doors to children who couldn't afford traditional music lessons. The piano room is going to be beautiful, Grace said, joining me in the main hall. She looked healthier than she had in years. The stress lines had faded, replaced by the kind of excitement I remembered from our childhood. Sophie walked in carrying coffee and financial reports. The scholarship fund is fully endowed, she announced. We can provide free music education for 150 children the first year, with capacity to grow. It was remarkable how natural this partnership had become. Grace had completed her teaching certification and would run the educational programs. Sophie had channeled her sales skills into fundraising and community outreach. I managed operations and coordinated with social services agencies who would refer students to us. But the real magic was simpler than that. We'd finally learned to work together instead of competing with each other. I got a call from the Chicago Tribune, Grace said. They want to do a feature story about the center. What did you tell them? That we'll consider it after we've actually helped some children. Sophie laughed. Look at us, turning down publicity. Dad would be so confused. We'd agreed never to publicly discuss Dad's true inheritance or the circumstances that had led us here. As far as anyone knew, we'd pooled our modest inheritances to start a family foundation. The truth was more complicated, but also more private. Speaking of Dad, I said, I have something for both of you. I handed them each an envelope containing copies of a letter I'd found in Dad's safe the week before, one I hadn't shown them during our emotional reunion. They read silently, and I watched their expressions change from curiosity to understanding to something that looked like peace. The letter was addressed to all 3 of us. My dearest daughters, if you're reading this together, then my plan worked better than I dared hope. You've learned to forgive each other, to value what matters, and to work as a team. The money was never the real inheritance. $4 million is enough to be comfortable, but not enough to replace the need for purpose and family. I wanted you to build something meaningful together, something that would outlast any bank account. The real inheritance is the family you choose to be from now on. All my love, always, Dad. We stood there in our unfinished music center, crying and laughing and holding each other like we should have been doing all along. He planned this too, Grace said wonderfully. This moment right here. Of course he did, Sophie said. Dad never did anything without a backup plan for the backup plan. I looked around at what we'd built together. Not just the building, but the partnership, the trust, the genuine love we'd rediscovered for each other. I think this might be his masterpiece, I said. But even as we celebrated our newfound unity, I knew the real test was still ahead. Building a music center was one thing. Making it work, sustaining it, and actually changing children's lives, that would require everything we'd learned about working together. The next few weeks would show us whether Dad's plan had truly worked, or whether we'd just created a beautiful illusion that would crumble under the pressure of real responsibility. The grand opening of the Chin Center was everything we dreamed it would be and more. 60 children from across Chicago's west side filled our classrooms, their faces bright with the kind of excitement that comes from discovering something you didn't know you were missing. 7-year-old Carlos, who lived with his grandmother in a nearby housing project, sat at our best piano picking out melodies with the focused intensity of a future concert pianist. 11-year-old Aisha, whose family had immigrated from Somalia, was learning violin with tears of joy streaming down her face. Grace moved between the classrooms like she'd been born to teach, patient with beginners and challenging for advanced students. Watching her work with children, I could see the person she'd always meant to be before corporate ambition had taken over her life. Sophie had surprised everyone by developing a gift for working with parents, helping families navigate not just the music program but connecting them with other social services they needed. Her sales background had translated perfectly into advocacy work. Miss Chun, Carlos's grandmother, approached me after the first day of classes. "I just wanted to thank you. Carlos hasn't stopped humming since he got home yesterday." "That's what we were hoping for," I said. "But it's more than that. He's different. Happier. Like he found something he didn't know he was looking for." That night, the three of us sat on the deck of the lake cabin, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset paint the water gold. "Did you ever imagine we'd end up here?" Grace asked. "Working together like this?" "Never," I admitted. "Loving each other again?" "I always hoped." Sophie raised her glass. "To Dad, who knew us better than we knew ourselves." "To second chances," Grace added. "To family," I concluded. "The kind we choose to be." We drank our wine and listened to the loons calling across the water, the sound Dad had always said was the most beautiful music in the world because it was both individual and harmonious. Separate voices creating something larger than themselves, just like us. A year later, the Chun Center had expanded to serve 300 children and had a waiting list of 150 more. We'd opened satellite programs in 2 other underserved neighborhoods and were planning a summer camp at the lake cabin. But the real measure of our success wasn't in numbers. It was in moments like watching Grace conduct the children's choir, seeing Sophie teach a shy teenager to believe in herself, or getting letters from parents whose children had discovered confidence through music. One evening, I found a note tucked into Dad's piano bench at the cabin, a piece of paper I'd somehow missed during all my previous searches. It was in Dad's handwriting, but dated just days before his death. "Maya, you were always my proudest achievement. Not because you sacrificed for me, but because you never lost your capacity to love people, even when they didn't deserve it. That gift will heal our family when the time comes. Trust in that gift and trust in the plan. Love, Dad." I sat at the piano and played one of Dad's compositions, a simple melody he'd written for our childhood summers at this very cabin. Through the window, I could see Grace and Sophie setting up for a small dinner party we were hosting for the center's board members. 3 years ago, we'd been strangers who shared a last name and a bitter history. Tonight, we were sisters, partners, and friends who'd built something beautiful together. Dad's plan had worked perfectly. But more than that, we'd taken his plan and made it our own, creating something even better than he'd imagined. 2 years after opening the Chin Center, we faced our first real crisis as partners. The city was threatening to shut down our West Side location due to zoning complaints from a developer who wanted to build luxury condos on the block. "They're offering us triple what we paid for the building," Sophie said, reviewing the legal papers during our weekly planning meeting. "And they'll relocate us to a facility in the suburbs. Better parking, newer building, easier for families with cars," Grace added. I looked at the photos covering our conference room walls. Hundreds of children who discovered music in this specific building, in this specific neighborhood, walking distance from their homes. "How many of our current students have cars?" I asked. Sophie checked her files. "Maybe 20% of families own vehicles. So we'd be relocating to serve different children, not the same ones." "The suburban facility would serve children too," Grace pointed out. "Maybe children who also need what we're offering." It was our first major disagreement as partners, and for a moment, I felt the old family dynamics trying to reassert themselves. Grace being practical, Sophie focused on the financial opportunity, me worrying about the people who'd be left behind. But something had changed in all of us over the past few years. "Let's table this decision," Grace said. I want to spend some time in the classrooms this week, really listening to our students and families. I'll research other potential locations in the neighborhood, Sophie added. Maybe there are options we haven't considered. And I'll meet with the city council, I said. See if there's any way to address the zoning issues without relocating. A week later, we reconvened with completely different perspectives. Grace had spent hours talking with students and parents. 90% of them said they wouldn't be able to continue lessons if we moved to the suburbs. This isn't just about music education, it's about community. Sophie had found 3 alternative buildings within walking distance. 2 of them would actually be cheaper to operate, and the third has space for expansion. I discovered that the zoning complaints were bogus, filed by the developer's lawyers to create artificial pressure. The city council is actually supportive of keeping us in the neighborhood. They're willing to fast-track permits for renovations. So we fight, Grace said. We fight smart, Sophie corrected. I've already started organizing the parents into an advocacy group. And I've contacted every journalist who covered our opening, I added. Amazing how much community support appears when people understand what's at stake. The developer withdrew his complaints 2 weeks later after a series of community meetings that drew hundreds of supporters and significant media attention. We used the experience to launch a permanent advocacy program, helping other community organizations fight similar battles. But the real victory wasn't keeping our building. It was discovering that we'd become the kind of partners who could handle conflict without destroying what we'd built together. Dad would be proud, Grace said as we celebrated with pizza in our rescued conference room. Of the advocacy work? Sophie asked. Of us, I said. Of how we handled disagreement without tearing each other apart. That night, I updated the letter I'd been writing to Dad, something I'd started doing after we opened the center as a way of keeping him informed about how his plan was working out. Dear Dad, I wrote, today we had our first real fight as partners and we survived it. More than survived. We grew stronger. I think that might be the most important lesson of all. Love, Maya. 5 years after Dad's death, on the anniversary of the day I'd first walked into that rusty lake cabin, the 3 Chin sisters sat on our restored pier, watching the sunrise paint the water silver and gold. The Chin Center now operated in 4 locations across Chicago, serving over 800 children annually. We've launched a teacher training program, established partnerships with the city's public schools, and created a scholarship fund that would operate in perpetuity. But more importantly, we'd become the family Dad had always dreamed we could be. I have an announcement, Grace said, pulling an envelope from her jacket pocket. Please tell me you're not quitting, Sophie said. We just got the hang of working together. Grace laughed. No, nothing like that. But I did get an offer I wanted to discuss with both of you. She handed us the letter. It was from the MacArthur Foundation, offering Grace a fellowship to study innovative approaches to music education in underserved communities. It's a huge honor, I said, reading the details. And a huge opportunity. It would mean traveling for research, maybe being away for months at a time, Grace explained. I wanted to make sure you were both comfortable with me pursuing it. 3 years ago, this would have been a crisis. Grace leaving would have felt like abandonment, like her prioritizing her career over family again. Now it felt like growth. Of course you should do it, Sophie said immediately. Think about what you could learn, what you could bring back to the center. And think about the recognition it would bring to our work, I added. This isn't Grace leaving the family business. This is the family business getting national attention. Grace's eyes filled with tears. You really mean that? We mean it, I said. Besides, Sophie and I are perfectly capable of keeping things running while you're off being brilliant. Hey, Sophie protested. I'm brilliant too. Fine. While you're both off being brilliant in different places. We laughed, the kind of easy, comfortable laughter that had taken years to rediscover. Later that morning, I walked alone to Dad's grave for the first time since his funeral. I'd avoided it for years, too angry and too hurt to face the finality of his death. But now I had things to tell him. Hi, Dad, I said, sitting cross-legged beside his headstone. I thought you'd want a progress report. I told him about the center, about the children whose lives had been changed by music, about the partnerships we'd built, and the community we created. I told him about Grace's fellowship and Sophie's plans to start a nonprofit consulting business. I told him about the family dinners we shared every Sunday and the way his granddaughter Emma, Grace's daughter, had started calling all three of us aunt. But mostly, I said, I wanted to thank you for knowing us better than we knew ourselves, for believing we could be better than we were, for having the courage to risk everything on the possibility that love could win. The wind rustled through the trees above his grave, and for a moment, I could almost hear his voice. That wasn't courage, my dear. That was faith. As I walked back to my car, I thought about the woman I'd been 5 years ago, bitter, isolated, convinced that sacrifice meant suffering in silence. I thought about the woman I was now, confident, connected, surrounded by family and meaningful work. The inheritance Dad had left me wasn't just money or life lessons. It was the chance to become the person I was always meant to be. That evening, the three of us gathered for our traditional Sunday dinner at the lake cabin. Grace brought her famous lasagna, Sophie contributed salad and wine, and I provided dessert and the setting. I've been thinking, Sophie said as we cleared the dishes, about what Dad would say if he could see us now. Probably that we took too long to figure it out, Grace suggested. Or that we exceeded his expectations, I countered. We stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the lake where we'd played as children, fought as adults, and finally found our way back to each other as sisters. You know what I think he'd say? Sophie asked. What? He'd say the real inheritance was the family we became along the way. We groaned at the terrible joke, then laughed until our sides hurt, the way only sisters can. Outside, the loons were calling across the water, their voices weaving together in perfect harmony while maintaining their distinct songs, just like us. The real inheritance wasn't the money, the lessons, or even the love we'd rediscovered. It was the family we'd chosen to become, and the knowledge that some bonds, once properly mended, could never be broken again.